Okay. Yeah. Do you wanna
I'm delighted to have So hello, and on the EU's forthcoming Sustainable Food Systems Framework Law that's brought to you by the European Environmental Bureau. So my name is Tasha Foot. I am an agri-food reporter with Euractiv. I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. So between climate change, the fallout caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year has demonstrated that the need to accelerate the transition to sustainable agri-food systems is more pressing than ever. And that is exactly what this law aims to do. So I won't go too far into the details of what exactly this framework is, because we have a wealth of expert panelists who are going to do that for us. But before we kick off, let me just firstly welcome all of you here in the room with us today, as well as all of you joining online. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to the Health and Food Safety Commissioner, Stella Kyriakides, who will be our keynote speaker for today's event. So let me just quickly set down a few housekeeping points. So the event will be split between two panel sessions. There will be a coffee break or a tea break, if you're English like me, in between. And at the end of each of our panel sessions, there will be an opportunity for those of you in the room to put your questions to the panelists. So do keep that in mind as we go along in the event. The event is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with you after the event, so you can relive the fun all over again. So without further ado, I would like to turn to Patrick ten Brink, who is the Secretary General of EPB, for his opening remarks. And Patrick, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Natasha. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and especially Stella Kyriakides. We actually had 180 people registering, but we've got a lot of people got the habit of being online, so we have many more people online. But I just want to say a few words in addition to the welcome, focusing on what we're speaking about today. And look, you can see this, but we have all the details. But I'm going to start a little bit earlier and simply underline that the Farm to Fork strategy already recognized the urgent need for an EU to transit towards a sustainable food system, of course. And we also underline that the science follows a basic scientific principle that you can only have food security in the long term if you have healthy biodiversity. If you've got no biodiversity, you have sick ecosystems, and you have no food security. So that's a little bit of a basis upon which to build. We've seen the momentous crisis with the Russian war in Ukraine and the impacts on food concerns and energy. But we've also seen that vested interests have used this crisis to try to push for certain things which we feel are not actually in line with the logic and the facts and what we actually need. And what we actually need is a transition to sustainable food systems now, even more than before. So this is something which we also address holistically. It's not just an issue over here. We need a sort of a system change in that. And so it's with great thanks that we look forward to, well, thanks for the work done by Commissioner Kyriakides on this. And in the next few months, we saw in the Commission work program, it's now been put forward from Q4 to Q3. So there's a lot to do in a short amount of time. So hopefully our contributions will help. I want to first, before I introduce 5 of the points, I want to also say that the wider civil society community is behind you. We know your situation is non-trivial in this political context, but this is what citizens think is the right thing. It also builds on science, and we have different professors speaking there, and we're here to support you to make sure that this sustainable food system law has the teeth it needs to be a transformative agenda. So just in terms of the 5 main points, they're in the document, but just to put them on the table first, we think it's critically important for there to be an adoption of a systemic and rights-based approach, ensuring policy coherence. And policy coherence is more than just a term, it's actually a necessity for things to avoid going the wrong way. We need to make sure that also that these rights work squarely on the shoulders of the public authorities. that sets the path of change and to enable the policy of change. We need the conditions to be changed to allow that. And this needs to have a system-wide guiding objective. Okay, it's not just parts, it's the whole system. Linked to that is the adoption of a consistent food environment approach. So basically making the sustainable choice the easier choice. At the moment, lots of citizens can't have the easy choices, the sustainable one, and having a new framed sustainable food law can move it in that direction. So here the food environments are simply particularly key. And in this context, merely providing transparent and comprehensive information to consumers, while useful, is insufficient. And I think in the panels we'll explore what else is needed beyond those issues. A third issue, we need to set clear legally binding targets and time-bound ones. We all know the benefits of targets to motivate action. Without them, a lot of things can't happen. And those should, at one level, focus on footprints, food waste as well as a wider issue linked to that every European has access to healthy, nutritious and sustainable diets. So this should be a right, and this should be a sort of a leitmotif as an objective, and also eradicate household food insecurity, which is so fundamentally important right now in the context of poverty and crisis around Europe, already exacerbated by energy. A fourth point is that we need engagement at all levels of governments to maximize the effectiveness. It is also beyond effectiveness, it's also on democratic ownership. We need to empower people all along the chain to be able to take the decisions they need to take to secure the future they need. In this context, we need national sustainable food plans to support effective implementation and build within these inclusive and participatory governance. We've seen some shortcuts with respect to participation in the last 6 months. We need to make sure this isn't undermined, because it's both about rights and agency of individuals, but it's also about democracy, which is fundamentally also at stake if we look at the various different political elections that we've seen in Europe. Finally, the fifth one, we need strong accountability and a performance framework. So for that, of course, we need a comprehensive set of indicators here. So I think that's sort of a key objective. And I think that's, I've got 5, and you've got 5 in there. But maybe just then to say that now we want to listen to what you have to say in terms of your vision. You've got, what is it, up to about 9 months, 12 months to be able to finish this law. And so we're here to be able to support you in this law. We hope it's a strong legislative transformative package, and civil society is here to help. And the debates we have around us today should hopefully show that the wider set of stakeholders are also engaged and willing to help make your issue a reality, so that we hope to support your legacy. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you in advance for all the debates we're going to have.
Thank you, Patrick, for the warm words. What was it you said? How many months? No pressure at all. So, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to start by thanking the European Environmental Bureau for organizing this event and for inviting me to open it. And I'm sure that there will be an excellent policy discussion to follow, because when you have this mixture of academics and policymakers and civil society coming together to discuss one of the most important and challenging tasks that we face as a society, as we heard, and that is making our food system sustainable, it is so important that we have these opportunities to have these discussions and exchange. Now, at the European Commission, we have been working on this for some time now. In 2020, we started off the transformation of our food system with the Farm to Fork strategy. And that is where we set out what I would say was our strategic vision of how to change the way we produce, the way we distribute, and we consume food in a way that supports the 3 dimensions of sustainability: the environmental, the social, and of course, the economic. The legislative framework for a union sustainable food system is one of Farm to Fork's flagship initiatives. And I really want to welcome the European Environmental Bureau's support to this. Our aim is threefold. The first is to lay foundations let's say, new foundations for future food systems. The second is to mainstream sustainability in all food-related policies. I think that this is very, very important. And the final point that I would like to say is that we aim to make food systems more resilient. So what we have seen is that the climate extremes are ravaging our food production, and even more recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really shone new light on the food system. And both of these has made it, I would say, painfully clear how our health and our ecosystems, our supply chains, our consumption patterns, and planetary boundaries are all so closely interlinked, something that we may not have realized, or many didn't see it, but this situation that we're in now has really made it very stark reality. EU's food system, one could say, is overstretched. And the climate and the environmental challenges and the unfair income distribution, poor working conditions, unhealthy diets, food waste and food insecurity are just some of the pressures that it faces. And these all threaten to undermine its future capacity to face and to respond to any disturbances and shocks. And of course, all these together threaten long-term viability and resilience. And this is why I believe that you would agree with me, is that it is so very urgent that we take action now. We need to act now. We need a systemic approach that can speed up and ease this transition towards sustainability. And to do this, the framework legislation will set out a common basis for action across the food system. It could function as a policy enabler, establishing common definitions, principles, and objectives to underpin food-related policies. Here we could see a mix of measures being considered, both to raise the bar on sustainability in the food system, but also to encourage actors to go that extra mile. In all we do, we must keep in mind the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. And importantly, the framework is not designed to work in isolation, but in conjunction with all the other initiatives which come under the Farm to Fork strategy. Also, systemic transformations cannot be designed and they cannot be implemented in a top-down manner. On the contrary, we're looking for active engagement of all the actors in the food system. And that is the only recipe for this transition's success. For example, civil society can engage and empower citizens and various social groups so that they can contribute to new forms of governance that we need for this transition. It is pivotal to the collective approach we need, bringing together public authorities at the EU, at the national and the regional and the local levels, actors all along the food chain, and of course, non-governmental organizations. Academia is so important with its deep knowledge. I believe it's uniquely placed to put forward ideas for the transformational changes that will place our food system on a path to sustainability. The scientific evidence for why and how the food system needs to change is ample. But what we really need is for you to be a voice. And as was already said by Patrick, we need you to be a voice that keeps this on everyone's radar, despite the challenges that we all know we are facing. We have been reaching out to stakeholders across the food system to take part in reflecting on how this framework for a sustainable EU food system can meet its transformational ambition. And organizations which are not present here today are among those who've responded, and I would like to sincerely thank you. So before ending these few words, I just want to say that in the last almost now 3 years, we have faced a number of crises. Pandemic is an ongoing crisis. It's not over. It's still there. And now we have the war on Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine. All of these have really highlighted the importance of the Commission's Green Deal, the importance of all the initiatives under our Farm to Fork strategy, and there's a number of them, and the importance that we all have in playing a role to work towards sustainable food systems. So crises should never be a reason to delay and postpone. Crises are a reason for us to highlight the importance of what we're learning from them, and despite the challenges, to move forward, taking into account the realities, because we need to be pragmatic, but at the same time, not losing focus of what we are setting out to do. So we will continue to seek your support, and as the work in the framework advances, we will welcome your further input, because it is through these kind of conversations that we will be able to move forward together. Thank you once again. I apologize for not being able to stay to follow the panels, but it is, as you can understand, rather challenging times. But I can assure you that I will, of course, be following what has been said today. I'll try and follow the podcast on Monday, which is going to be interesting. And I look forward to working with you again in the future. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for setting that very comprehensive overview. And so now that gives us the opportunity to start digging into details, and I will move to our first panel session of today. So I'd like to open this up, which will be focusing on the theme of imagining a circular food system within planetary boundaries. So to help us explore this theme, we have with us today Camille Perrin, who is a Senior Food Policy Officer at BUIC. Camille is with us in the room, so excellent. We also have two other panelists joining us today remotely. So hopefully you'll see them on the screen very, very soon. So that is Professor Imke de Boer, who is Professor of Livestock and Sustainable Food Systems at the Wageningen University, that she is Imke. And we also have Tim Portland, who is a circular economy specialist at the Finnish Innovation Fund. So soon. So we're going to hear firstly some opening remarks from each of our panelists, a couple of whom have prepared a short presentation for us. So let me firstly turn to you, Camille, as you're here with us in the room, for your introductory remarks. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to turn something. Thank you. Sorry, it's the first in-person event in a while, so just need to get used to it again. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the EEB for the invitation to participate in this event. Perhaps quickly a few words about my organization, BUIC. BUIC is the European Consumer Organization. We represent 46 national independent consumer organizations across Europe, and we bring the voice of our members to EU policymakers to try and improve the lives of European consumers. And in the food area, this includes ensuring that everyone has access to a healthy, sustainable diet. So that's a quite ambitious program. As I'm sure we all know, because that's part of the reason why we're here today, the way we produce and consume food in the EU is not sustainable. It's a major driver of climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation. It's also not sustainable from a health perspective. Check the obesity epidemic. The World Health Organization has warned that obesity is on track to overtake smoking as the main cause of cancer. And since we are talking today about circularity, I also need to mention food waste. Just yesterday, Eurostat released new data on food waste levels across Europe. And basically, we waste annually 127 kilograms of food per person. So not all of it at consumer level, but still a big part of it. So we need to change the way we produce and consume food in the EU. And the good news is that consumers are willing to change. 2 in 3 have said in survey we conducted that they are willing to change the way they eat for sustainability. The problem is that they do not only need to change the way they eat for the transition to sustainable society. They will also need to change the way they move, the way they heat their homes. So that's a lot of transformation for people, for consumers. And so if we want to avoid backlash, we need really to bring people along, and we need to make sure that eating sustainably becomes easy for consumers. So I hope that today we can discuss how do we do that concretely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kemi. Of course, the consumer perspective is vital here, and we'll be digging into this a lot more later on. So thank you very much for your introductory remarks. So let me now turn to Imke. So Imke has prepared a short presentation for us, which you should see on the screen. So Imke, the floor is yours.
Yeah. You don't see it yet. Do you see it now?
Yes, we do.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity in 5 minutes, so it's quite short, to present some suggestions that I think are very important to move towards sustainable food systems. The first one actually is given here. I do believe that we need to define the safe and just operating space for food production. And this is really essential, and the EU has a role to play here. So we not only need to integrally define the planetary boundaries, so the boundaries, the environmental ceilings of the food system at European, national and regional level, but also define the social fundament, which are actually the fundamental needs of humans and animals. And in terms of humans, this relates, for example, to good labor conditions. And in terms of animals, this relates to the ability to express species-specific behavior. Because only if these ceilings are clear, we can move to sustainable food systems. So once these ceilings are clear, how do you then move towards a healthy system? Well, we have to feed an increasing number of people with a healthy diet. We all know that. And to do so, we have to use our natural resources, arable land, grassland, and natural waters in a sustainable way. So the first key principle is that we have to safeguard these precious natural resources by using regenerative farming practices. Second, we have to use arable land, that's land that is suitable for the production of plant-sourced food, for the production of food, plant-sourced food for us, humans, and not for feed to actually feed livestock, which is what we're currently doing on 40% of our arable land. And during the production of this plant-sourced food, we produce all sides of side streams. And of course, the first priority is to avoid food losses and waste, like just mentioned, very important. But if we have side streams that are unavoidable, we should recycle them back into the food system, either as feed to animals or to feed the soil. And similarly, if we harvest from natural waters, we should harvest in such a way that we feed ourselves and not the livestock. These kind of principles, we have summarized them, and I think it takes too much time to explain them all here in a Nature Food paper, but these are key ecological principles we have to adhere to if we want to move with our food system, or maybe a bit broader even, with our bio-based circular society, to a situation that fits within the planetary boundaries. I would also like to stress that the role of livestock in such a food system is actually to upcycle unavoidable leftovers from plant-sourced food production and grassland into animal-sourced food. And that also implies that we have to change our consumption towards a more plant-based system. Here, we actually computed how much animal protein we, as an average person in the European Union, could eat, or globally could eat in our diet daily, if we would consume animal source food only from animals that are fed with leftovers and grass resources. It's about 25 grams of animal protein per day. And we need about 60 grams of protein per day. So the majority is from plant source food. And what we here see is that you see the different people living in different areas of the world. So in Asia, about 50% of the people live in Asia. You see that in Europe, which is actually the green area, we have to about halve our consumption of animal source food to use our natural resources in an effective way. So we have to move towards a more plant-based diet to actually fit within the planetary boundaries. So production has to change to regenerative practices. Livestock should not eat feed that's actually edible by humans, and we need to change our diet. So we need all kind of changes to move towards this system. And like I just said, we shouldn't, in the discussion about moving towards a healthy and circular diet, we often forget about respecting animals and the possibility for farm animals to have a happy life. And I think that's also essential to take that into consideration immediately. So if you look here in the inner circle, we actually need an economy that goes beyond GDP and that serves the planet and all inhabitants. So that's quite difficult. And there is also not one element that actually allows us to move towards this new future. So we need a collective change. We need institutional changes, technological changes, etc. We need all kinds of changes to move towards this actually new food system. And it takes really too much time, but I can explain a bit more to explain how such a food future could look like. But together with some colleagues, I participated in the Rockefeller Food Systems Vision Prize that was launched in November 2019. And over 1,300 teams did apply and 10 teams did win. And we actually did there envision this future food systems that looks totally different. And that vision is called Rerouting the Dutch Food System. And I think it would be valuable for those in the audience that need to think about it to have a look at the long read of this vision, because that actually demonstrates how we all have to change to move towards this healthier, more sustainable food system. But in 5 minutes, that's rather complicated to describe. But the main message is there, we need a paradigm shift. So that was what I wanted to share. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions or discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inke. You're right, it's a lot of ground to cover in 5 minutes, so we will do our best to get a little bit more into the details in this discussion. So let me now turn to Tim, who should be connected online. Tim has also prepared a short 5-minute presentation for us. Hello, Tim, see you now. So Tim, you have 5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I believe I was given 7, but I will do my best to work with you accordingly.
I might want to know this.
No, but yeah, thanks again for the invitation. It's really great to be here today, and I could just agree with the previous speaker here. That's we really need a paradigm shift. So I definitely think that Imke is right there. So I would like to highlight this from the role of how a circular economy is also central in tackling biodiversity loss. But hopefully you can see my slides now, and I would share. Yes, I can see it myself here. So I am from the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, where I work as a circular economy specialist. And first, I should just say that since Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra is a combination of a think, do, connect tank and a future fund. And we work on biodiversity, the circular economy, and climate and energy issues as well. And in 2018, we worked with Material Economics and other partners to, for instance, show that the circular economy is not just an end in itself, it's also a means to an end. It's a powerful tool for tackling climate mitigation, tackling climate change. And in EU heavy industry, for instance, you could tackle about half of those emissions. We this year have also looked at what the circular economy could mean for biodiversity. So we work together with Vivid Economics, who have provided analytics for the Dasgupta review to create a scenario for a circular economy by 2050, looking at the four biggest sectors to see what the impacts of such a transition could look like. And to give you just a bit of flavor of what we looked at here. So in these four sectors, I would highlight the food and agriculture sector, that you would see food consumption and food waste both fall by half by 2050. I would also shift to regenerative agriculture on 60% of croplands, and and also apply regenerative principles on 18% of pasture lands. So it would be a rather transformational shift. And taken together, working with these four sectors, what we can see is that the transition to a circular economy could free up as much agricultural land as 1.5 times the size of the European Union, while also sparing forests corresponding to the size of Argentina. So it is a rather significant shift. And what we see is that if we continue as before, we will lose biodiversity way past 2050. That's this black downward sloping line that you see here. But putting these four sectors together, you see that the circular economy can turn the tide on biodiversity. But it's really with the food and agriculture sector that you see the biggest impact by far. And you also see that happens earlier on compared to the other sectors. So that's where we can see the fastest and most significant impact. So the good news is that the circular economy can play a really meaningful role and help tackle biodiversity loss by the next decade already. And as mentioned, the biggest impact is really from the food and agriculture sector. And we also see that the same measures are really significant in terms of climate mitigation. So, for instance, we could reach the targets in LULUCF. So looking at land use change in forests in Europe, we could reach that target by 2030, and we could reduce methane emissions from agriculture by almost 90%. So it's really by this enabling this shift in land use in particular that we can make this possible. This is also a very difficult time for Europe and the rest of the world. And of course, it's essential to also build more resilience in our economy. And for instance, our scenario makes possible a 30% reduction in fertilizers onto croplands, which goes beyond the farm to fork strategy that talks about 20%, for instance, a 20% reduction. I'd also mention another finding. It's that we can't look at this only in Europe. While we can take action here, there's a lot of food waste in Europe. The impacts on biodiversity will largely be felt in other parts of the world, in particular in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we need to talk about the outsourced biodiversity footprint that we have in Europe. But I would like to highlight three key implications before I finish. And the first one is that the EU is very well positioned to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss together through a circular economy, as we show. So we need to pay particular attention to a limited number of commodities, such as palm oil, coffee, and not least beef, which account for an outsized share of our biodiversity footprint. So here, I think the new legislation for deforestation-related supply chains are key, but at the same time, we need to address the total demand for land, the total global land use. Otherwise, the risk is that the pressure just shifts production away from these certified areas elsewhere, and we won't solve the problem as a whole. And here, the circular economy can reduce waste. We can enable smarter design for tomorrow's substitutes of, for instance, alternative proteins, but also of other commodities. So this is the second message, that it's really where we can see the biggest impacts is through this shift away from animal intensive protein sources, diversifying that to alternative ones where there's less waste and pollution, and where we are more land efficient. And we can see that some countries in Europe, like France and Denmark, have already invested in such alternative proteins in their development. And we think that these proteins could also play a really important role in the minimum criteria for sustainable public procurement in the Sustainable EU Food System Initiative. And I think also that a European protein strategy could play a really important role here, if we also remember that we must talk about the human consumption of plant protein. And here, China in their most recent 5-year plan are already talking about synthetic proteins as well. So there's a bit of competition here that I think is quite interesting. The final message is that, yes, we can reduce the pressure on land, but it's also really important what we do with the land that's been given to us. So we can apply regenerative principles on agricultural land. That's about 10% of our scenario if you include regenerative agriculture and forestry. So it's still significant what we do with the land that remains under production. And in Finland, for instance, we worked with a local partner to help farmers find optimal practices for Finland, where we can drive regenerative outcomes that work here in Finland. And across other parts of Europe, we need other practices. So we need to learn from each other. But we also need more research into what practices are optimal in different parts of Europe with different pedoclimatical conditions as well. So to conclude, we don't have much time, so each solution really needs to help solve as many crises at the same time. And here, the circular economy is one really important tool. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim. And before we get on with the panel discussion, I'll just remind everyone there will be a short Q&A at the end. So if anything's sparking your imagination, you can keep those questions in mind, and you can put those to our panelists at the end. So I will move into the panel discussion now. I think there's a few different keywords I'm hearing here again and again. One is regenerative, and we'll come back to that theme. Another one is another word beginning with R, which is resilience. We already heard Camille speak about resilience, and so did Tim there, and the Commissioner earlier on. It's a key theme of this year. So let's talk about the concept of circularity and resilience. So maybe Camille, come to you first. How would a circular food system make us more resilient? Good question.
I think I supposed to.
Yeah.
I think I would have to pick up on the diet point, which has been made by Imke, but also by Tim. We really think that as part of this circular food system, consumers can really be a key levels of change through their diets. And in our view, sustainability diets, which are more plant-based, are really a triple win. They are a win for climate because they can contribute to lowering greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. They are a win for health because I mentioned earlier the health impact of healthy diets. They are also a win for food security because it can contribute to reducing the food feed competition. So we really need to support consumers in shifting towards more plant-based diets. And here, the concept we would like to emphasize is really that of food environments, enabling food environments. What do I mean by food environment? It can seem a bit abstract, but basically these are all the factors that influence and shape our consumption choices as consumers. So that is advertising, pricing, marketing, etc. Just to give you an example, it's the promotional offers in supermarkets. So these are all the factors that lead you to choose certain foods over others. So as I said earlier, consumers are willing to change, but they face barriers, and we need to address those to really empower them to, through the diets, contribute to a more circular food system.
And Imke, let me bring you in on the same theme here. So in your opinion, how does circularity of the food system make us more resilient?
Yeah, actually, in our vision, diversification was one of the key elements. So, for example, in order to avoid the use of pesticides, which we don't want because it destroys soil life, pollination, and even human health, you need to diversify different crops on the same field, like in intercropping or these type of cropping. So it's diversification of your cropping system to suppress diseases and pests. You need a diverse type of animals to kind of upcycle leftovers and grass resources, because ruminants are good in upcycling grass resources, whereas pork are good in upcycling, let's say, wet waste products. So you need diverse animals. And you need diverse farming types, because each farmer is in a different context and is a different person. And we need to diversify our diet. So this diversification, I think, is a key element that was part of our food vision and that contributes to resilience. So I think it's key.
Diversity is key there. Tim, you already did mention resilience. You're talking about a 30% reduction of fertilizers. Perhaps you'd like to expand a little bit more on this concept.
Well, I'd like to think of resilience as, well, this is really about three things. On one hand, we're quite dependent on a few number of resources, as Imke mentioned, that our system today, it's very, we need to diversify across more species. So that's the first one. The second one is that just looking at prices today, we've noticed that it's quite a volatile commodity market. And for anyone that's watched the news in the recent year with our supply chains disruption, that's the third one. So these are all things that mean that our system today, our economy, is not very resilient. And what we can do here with the circular economy is that it can serve as a buffer for these risks. Essentially, we can use our residues in more efficient way. We can recycle more of those. If we can also design products with less inputs in the first place, we're less exposed to these resources that we need as inputs. So there's a whole other set of, and with regenerative agriculture as well, we can use less fertilizers, and in turn, in certain ways, also less energy. So we can it works in the immediate crisis, but also over the long term.
And Tim, I'm keeping you here. For many years, the European agri-food model and many agri-food models have been pushing towards, production. This focus on productivity. It's led to overproduction and therefore waste. In your work, you refer a lot to how a circular economy can help redefine our conception of growth. Could you perhaps elaborate on that point a little bit for us?
Well, I think the circular economy, there's not one definition of a circular economy. There's more than 100 different definitions. So it means different things to different people. Some people talk about degrowth, some talk about economic growth. I think the point of a circular economy, regardless of what we're talking about here, is that it's a way of giving us more value from what we have. And regardless of from what political camp you're from, everyone hates waste. And here, put simply, we can get more value from what we have. Of course, here we have to be a little bit careful. So if we talk about the circular economy, sometimes there are rebound effects. So if there are efficiency gains, they can be eaten up by more consumption. For instance, if there's car sharing and car sharing becomes more accessible, the result might be that we just drive more, and those efficiency gains are eaten up by more consumption. So we have to be really careful and look at this at a systems level. But the good news here, I think, is that when we talk about the food system, it works a little bit differently. If we cut food waste and if we shift to more alternative proteins, it doesn't mean that we will just eat more and more meat, or that we will eat more and more food, because there are physical limits to how much we can eat. There are still rebound effects we have to talk about, but they're different compared to other sectors. I think that's also some good news for these food waste measures and alternative protein measures.
Imke, let me bring you in now. In your work, you talk about the need to rethink our economic system in a way that recognizes our natural capital and our social capital. So we're talking here human and labour rights, animal rights. Could you maybe elaborate on how that kind of shift in core priorities could facilitate a transition to circularity?
Yeah, so in my opinion, there is a role for governments there. I do not think we should leave, for example, welfare-friendly or unfriendly systems to the market. It's like children rights. I think we should organize our system in such a way that everyone who's working in the food system has good labor conditions, for example, and every farm animal that we keep in the food system can have a happy life. And of course, you can question what that actually implies, but that specifically implies that an animal is able to express main species specific behaviors, which often is not the case in intensive animal husbandry. And I think that should not be left to the market. So I think we should make laws there. Similarly, I do believe that we should, as I stated when I started, that we should define the ceilings of the food system at a regional level. So how much land and how much water can we use for food production, etc. And then you have the safe and just operating space. And then I do believe that farmers will do better than that, will provide more positive ecosystem services, for example, than others within this boundary should be rewarded for what they are doing. But these boundaries, I think, are essential to start off with. Yeah, that's a little bit like the donut economy, of course, from Kate Raworth, except from the fact that she's not really addressing the needs of animals. So that's why I added that specifically.
And I'm now going to push a little bit on this idea of regenerative agriculture. We've heard this come up. I think all of you have mentioned regenerative agriculture. And also this idea of cutting our meat consumption. It seems to me there's a bit of a mix here, because on the one hand, it seems that a key principle of regenerative agriculture, animals are a key principle here, you know, cycling nutrients, soil health, reduction of synthetic fertilizers, which we've spoken about. And we're also talking about the need to reduce meat production and consumption. So maybe a comment here, perhaps from Camille first, about how to kind of square that circle and how to understand maybe the nuances of that discussion.
Yeah. It seems it goes to sleep each time. But I think there's an issue. Yeah. I would address this from the health perspective, because that's what we that's where we have more our focus as a consumer organization, obviously. What we see is that today in the EU, we know that our diets are not healthy and they're also not sustainable, but we eat too many calories, but also too much red and processed meat. If you compare current consumption patterns in the EU to dietary guidelines, which are the recommendation from authorities for health diets, there is really a big margin for reducing meat consumption, and that would have beneficial health effects. On top of it, we know that it will also be good for climate, for the environment. So that's where really we see, as I mentioned earlier, some benefits, both from a health perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. Now, if you ask consumers, okay, whether they would be willing to reduce their meat consumption, in a survey that we conducted a couple of years ago, a third of consumers said that they would be willing to eat less meat and to replace it, for instance, by plant-based alternatives, which are the preference of consumers compared to some more, we heard about synthetic meat, etc. But again, we need to empower consumers to walk the talk, because in survey they said, yeah, I'm willing to reduce my consumption of meat for health reasons, for environmental reasons, but we really need to make it easy for them. And I go back to the food environment, which we need to make sure that the price of healthy, sustainable food is send the right signal. So basically, healthy, sustainable food must be the most affordable one. So we need to really nudge consumers toward these more healthy plant-based diets. That doesn't mean that we all need to become vegan or vegetarian, and clearly that's not the willingness of consumers. But there is really a big margin for reducing our consumption, still maintaining what is needed for health, but also having an impact for climate and environment.
And perhaps Imke, I will bring you in. I saw you both nodding very vigorously. So perhaps you'd like to also come in on this point about regeneration and the role of animals and, you know, this kind of this concept.
Yeah. Well, I actually agree, and science also shows that changing the food environment is actually more effective than leaving it to individual choices. So we should change the food environment and make sure that local plant-based and sustainable food is the default option and affordable. But I think on the other hand, it's still also important to what we say also in the food vision, we have to connect people again to their food. So in terms of education and explaining, storytelling, and so on, making them aware or making them feel in some ways or another how much time and effort and love it takes to produce your food so that you don't waste it and that you pay attention to it. So I think we need education, we need extension, we need all these different type of tools besides nudging. Nudging is hugely important. And in terms of nudging, we thought about the concept of food democracy, because we saw that in community farms where actually citizens together with a farmer are deciding on what they grow and how they grow it. These people waste less food. So we also thought about a food panel for each retailer in our food vision, and that these retailers actually have to adhere their program not only to the stakeholders but also to this food panel to kind of bring in some kind of food democracy in these kind of major sellers of our foods, because somehow I think we have to break the power either by enforcing via the government that they work on sustainability, but maybe also by bringing in our own our own choices there. So some food democracy. So yeah.
So Cami, Imke mentioned there the need to bring consumers closer to their food, and she's talking about the need for education. I think that's a very nice bridge into asking you a question here. I mean, consumers are often depicted as either maybe misinformed, or maybe there's an idea there's reluctance to kind of change. But you know, also you spoke about these numbers about how consumers want more sustainable food systems. They want to change. So maybe you can talk to us a bit more about the role of consumers in this transition and whether they're on board with this transition.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I covered it partly already. I think they really can be, well, the demand side can be a key lever of change when you consider diets. About consumers, indeed, they are willing to change. But what is also important to note is that they also face obstacles in trying to eat more sustainably. So it's important that we support them in transforming intention into action. And these barriers, well, they are quite well known. It's first of all pricing. Consumers have told us that, well, very often they think that sustainable food is more expensive. They also find that it's not sufficiently available. They also struggle, in fact, to know what is sustainable and what is not. There's a lot of conflicting messages around there, also a lot of marketing and greenwashing. So it's not always easy to know what is sustainable or not. And also quite interestingly, and this is something that comes across in various research, consumers see first and foremost sustainable food as, let's say, a challenge for the whole of society to tackle, not specifically for them. They really expect food businesses, food producers to shift to more sustainable practices. And also what has been mentioned by Imke, they really look to their governments to take leadership to promote sustainable food production and consumption. So they certainly have a big role to play, but they also expect their governments to make it easier for them.
You mentioned two interesting themes there I'm going to ask you a bit more about. One was price, which of course is a major issue, especially at the moment, right? Everyone's extremely concerned about the price of food going up, about affordability of not just about having enough food, but having nutritious food, right? So maybe you can dig into this a little bit more about, you know, is this about lowering the price of food? How do we make sure everyone can afford this? Maybe a comment about true cost accounting and how this can maybe fit into this and this idea of price.
Yeah, it's a very good point, although a very difficult one as well. It's true that today consumers who want to eat more sustainably often need to pay more for food. I say often because it's not always the case. For instance, if you replace part of the meat in your diet with pulses, even organic pulses, it's in fact, well, it's healthier. it's better for climate, but it's also cheaper, in fact. So it's not always the case that you have to pay more. But overall, that's the case that food prices do not send the right signal because the environmental, social, health impacts are not internalized in the price that we pay at the supermarkets. And what is also very interesting is that 8 in 10 Europeans would agree that food prices should reflect the true cost. So that is all these costs, of course, the cost of production, but also for the environment, etc. So how do we move towards true cost accounting in a way that is just and that still makes sure that everyone can access healthy diet? That's really the difficult question. So we hear a lot of discussion around incentives like 0% VAT on certain products, healthy food, also taxes, which obviously are much less popular, especially in current times of high food inflation. So, and also something that we think is really important is that the consumer acceptance of taxes is likely to be very low, especially if they feel that they are the ones to absorb all the transition costs, whereas producers escape their responsibility. So we think that what we need to work on first and foremost is farm subsidies, because there are still some harmful subsidies that continue to support unsustainable practices. So we need to repurpose farm subsidies to support farmers, to reward farmers that are producing more sustainably. And this will also have an impact on food prices eventually. And I also need to say a few words, obviously, about food affordability, because we are at the moment a food affordability crisis in the EU. We know what the drivers are. It's because the EU food system is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on imported fertilizers and feeds. So definitely the farm-to-fork strategy is an answer to that, but we also need adequate social policies to, let's say, cushion the cost of the transition for the lower income consumers, because the transition will have a cost, we have to be honest with that, but this cost would be much lower than the cost of doing nothing. So we need a range of measures, and I would really focus on repurposing farm subsidies and also having social policies that can make sure that everybody can access healthy sustainable diets.
And you also mentioned this idea of kind of greenwashing. And I think what something is a little bit interesting, it's not a term, but maybe I'm going to coin it. There's also potentially this risk of around regenerative agriculture. It's become quite a buzzword, I think, a new buzzword that's agriculture, all different things. And then sometimes the definition can maybe be lost. And I'm wondering if you think there's a kind of risk of regenerative agriculture washing, you know, businesses kind of jumping on this bandwagon, and they made me a comment about how consumers can understand what this is and how to kind of prevent this kind of regenerative agriculture washing.
I completely agree. Personally, I don't know what that means. I've been sitting with my colleague just coming to this event. I know what organic farming is. It's very clear, it's certified, but regenerative agriculture, I don't know what this means. It can be potentially a set of practices which are really close to organic, perhaps not certified, but for consumers to trust that, okay, if they pay more for certain food, they have to be sure that it has really an impact for the environment, for climate, etc. So organic is very is well known. It's trustworthy for consumers. Regenerative, perhaps we need to define it more and make sure that there is no risk of greenwashing. We also see a lot of carbon neutral products now, carbon neutral meat, carbon neutral dairy. There's a lot of greenwashing going on, definitely. So we need more rules to make sure that consumers are not misled and are not paying for something that does not really bring any benefits at the end of the day.
So Tim, maybe I can come to you on this one. Regenerative agriculture, that's a definition we've just heard from Camille. Maybe you can come back on this one, how we can kind of prevent this or make it clearer what regenerative agriculture really is.
Well, I think it's very confusing for a lot of people, and you also hear people talking about regenerative economics, and regenerative to refer sometimes just to anything that is remotely sustainable without having any substantiating any of those claims. But I think it's important to remember that it is an umbrella concept, and I think that therein some of its strengths also lies. So we can talk about, for instance, if we talk about agroecology, there are certain no-till methods that we can talk about, permaculture, polyculture. So it can mean capture different things that we can use selectively. So we would also have elements of organic agriculture, of course, but I think here I am looking forward to the science-based targets for nature that will be published next year. So here in Finland, we worked with 10 Finnish companies to pilot these targets, but we have to wait until next year before there's more, well, in terms of guidelines of what this will mean. So it's a little bit frustrating, but I think again it's important to keep in mind that there are very different conditions even in Europe. So there are different pedoclimatical conditions that we have to be aware of. So it can't be the same regenerative agriculture in Finland as in Spain, for instance. So, but hopefully the Science-Based Targets for Nature will provide some guidance next year.
And perhaps Imke, you'd like to come in on that, on the same theme. I saw you nodding away there.
Yeah. In my opinion, I do see some greenwashing in using terminologies. We did a literature review on what regenerative agriculture actually was. And there you see that it very much leans indeed on concepts like in agroecology. It starts from a healthy soil and in organic farming. So it's not that new, actually, in my opinion. So I do see a little bit of greenwashing by embracing this concept is embraced by big companies, and it gives them the opportunity to again rethink what regenerative agriculture actually is. So in my opinion, it's very close to what I also defined, that you need to safeguard your natural resources in such a way that you can use them in the long run, and they can regenerate themselves, so that you respect the absorptive capacity of these soils, so that the nutrients are not leaching too much. So it's very much just related to environmental sustainability. So and that's also what our paper did show. But still, I do believe in those approaches, so in those agroecological, organic, biodynamic, permaculture, agroforestry approaches. So I'm not disqualifying the concept. Yeah, so because I do feel that that's the approach to move on. And I do agree with the speaker in the room that the only alternative that's actually regulated, certified, is organic farming. And that's probably also why it's taken up in the farm to fork strategy, because it's clear and it's defined. So yeah, but going in that direction, I think is a must.
Thank you very much. I'll just finish up. I think we've got time for, I'll do one more question, and this will be, I think, to Tim, because you mentioned this in your opening remarks. It's a slightly different theme here. It's about kind of looking outside of Europe. Because of course, circularity is not just about how it would help us here, but also looking elsewhere. You know, maybe you could speak a bit about how this could also help limit negative impacts on third countries.
Well, I think it's really important to talk about from the point of the circular economy, which is what I'm qualified to speak about. It's really about tackling biodiversity loss in two different ways. On one hand, I think Europe is already doing a really good job on there's legislation for deforestation related supply chains. There's also a lot of work on greening supply chains and making sure that production is sustainable, and there are ways of certifying that. But the second part that's, I think, equally important is that we really need to reduce the total pressure on nature. For instance, I just heard this morning, it's something quite a little bit ridiculous. In Finland, there was a way of measuring which products have the biggest impacts on nature, so the biggest biodiversity footprint, and it turned out that pork in Finland has a lower biodiversity footprint than vegetables. And the logic there is that in Finland there's overproduction of pork, and that doesn't cause land use change in Finland. But the vegetables, that Finland is a cold country, so we import vegetables, they would cause land use change in other countries. So they would have a higher biodiversity footprint. So the conclusion there for some is that, well, we should eat more pork, which is, of course, a ridiculous conclusion. So we really have to look at this at the systems, at a global level, because our markets are related. And at the same time, as we make sure that we look at the local biodiversity impacts, that we make sure that production is sustainable, if it's organic or regenerative, I think we can talk about the details, but the point is that at the same time, we need to reduce the total pressure on nature. So here I think we need some sort of cap of that sort. In Finland, we have a cap on resource use by 2035, that we don't use this, so there's an absolute target that we use only so many resources. Otherwise, I don't think it's a circular economy unless we'd reduce the total resource load. Otherwise, it risks being greenwashing. And I think similarly, when we talk about this as a global level, we need to really make sure that we reduce the total pressure on nature. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to open the floor up for questions, and I might be maybe slightly provocative here, but we've spoken a few times about producers, so we don't have a producer representative here on the panel. I was wondering if there's maybe anyone from a farmers association or a farmer that might have a question. I'll give you the floor first. Yes, there's one over there. Do you need my microphone? Yes. Hang on.
Thank you very much. Tobias Heinz from the Danish Agriculture and Food Council. Quite fascinating debate. I would have a question to Ingrid Bohr, because I understand that you're talking, well, you're somehow skeptical towards the market economy. And so you're talking about, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we might call it kind of a planned vision for a kind of a planned food systems economy, with some community farms that are subject to food democracy. So I'm wondering, as a consumer in such a food systems or food democracy, would I then be joining? How would I join? Would I have to buy my way into such a farm? Should I also, as a consumer, run the risk when harvests fail sometimes, or bad weather conditions and all this? How would the food systems, democracy impact on how my farm, what it would produce?
Yeah.
And how should how much would it cost me as a consumer also to buy myself into this, and how much time should I spend on this?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the question. The example I gave was from what we call in the Netherlands the herenboerderijen. And these are community farms where 200 families indeed invest 2,000 euros each. And nowadays, the money you bring in is dependent on your income, but this is how it started. So it's more accessible for people with varying incomes. And then you basically start a farm together, and you hire a farmer, and you make a farm plan, and you start farming. You don't have to farm yourself. The farmer is actually farming. But there is an initial investment, and then each week, once the farm is running, you get your organic food at a price that's actually lower than the price in the supermarket. And that's actually going quite well now in the Netherlands, and more people want to join such a farm. About 60% of their food is coming from the farm. Of course, you don't produce coffee and bananas, etc., so you will import still some. But you're very much connected to your food. You know where your food grows. You eat with the seasons. You eat mainly plant-based. Your children learn how food is produced, how to cook things from raw materials, and so on. The thing is that I think this is a very good system, and it's actually getting more and more attention, but it will not be the system that everyone wants to join. So this is why I still do believe that we will probably sell our food also via supermarkets, or maybe future different types of supermarkets or internet supermarkets or whatever. And that's why I also do believe that in these kind of systems, we need to kind of bring in the food democracy, which we also see at the community farms, because they basically decide all together with the farmer how to grow the food, when to grow what, and etc. along the entire season. And that actually works quite well.
Thank you very much. I have a question here at the front.
Hello, my name is Yvonne Remmers from the True Animal Protein Price Coalition. Some of our partners are also farmer organizations. And yeah, what I heard from the two scientists that they both said we need at the EU level a reduction of meat and also dairy products by 50% if it's a sustainable food system. And I saw in the EEB paper also saying that we need a reduction of meat and protein consumption by with 30% in 2030 and 60% in 2040. So this is a big change in Europe. So, and I'm curious, so what kind of policy tools does the EU have to reduce this consumption? Because I heard from Camille, make the alternatives cheaper. Okay, that's one option, but will this really lead to a halving meat consumption? Or do we need taxes as well, or other policies? That's the question.
Is your question to Tim or to Imke?
Maybe it's all. Because we are looking for the right tools to reduce this. This is a huge task.
Who would like to come in on this one?
I'm happy to say something about it, but Tim probably as well. But I think you need an umbrella of measures. There is no one tool there. So you need the government to force, let's say, supermarkets to sell what is good for us and to kind of offer more plant-based food, to lower the tax on vegetables and fruit, maybe even increase the tax on meat products. But I think we should just pay the fair price for these products and set the boundaries. And we need education, and we need extension, and et cetera, et cetera. I think we need that all because it's so hugely complicated to change. And we also need knowledge, for example, on how to eat with beans, like the previous speaker in the room. And that's also my own experience, is that it doesn't have to be more expensive to eat less animal source food. And you don't need meat replacers necessarily, but you need new cooking information. You need knowledge. You need to invest in that. So in education and in schooling. And so that takes time, but you need all these different things, in my opinion. So Tim, please.
No, I can only agree. And I think what you highlighted before also, Imke, that this is, well, the price differential is really important. That, well, it should be become the default option, so to speak. But I think here there's so many different things we can work on. Procurement is a really powerful tool here that it's can drive as a sort of well, help create a market for these products. And again, I think this is also with animals that could also use more. Well, in terms of feed, we could also talk about alternative proteins there. And I think it's also an investment opportunity we see in France, in Denmark, and also in other countries that you're investing into the development of this. So this is an area of competition. So we need those investments. Those are really important policy tools. But and I think that's a chance also, again, going back to the point of resilience, to link to other policy areas. That in Finland, for instance, there are some companies that try and make alternative proteins from local fava beans rather than importing soy. So that's really important, because ultimately in the background, we also need to talk about this total pressure on nature. Otherwise, the risk is that we just outsource these impacts from Europe. So we need something to address that as well.
And perhaps we've got lots of hands here. Perhaps I'll have one more question. Maybe if it's a nice short question, perhaps maybe on the wider theme of circularity. How am I going to choose who's going to go? I actually think you had your hand up first, so we'll come to this lady here.
Thank you very much. My name is Hans Rosen, educational ecologist. And the word education has been mentioned, but what is not happening is, and I've lived around Europe and worked in different farms, multi-dimensional roles of farming, not just food production, but also the social, the care, the health roles that they can play, and particularly farm schools and forest schools. And I'm very much involved in that. This is one part of the education. And second, unfortunately, also what we see in farmers in the Netherlands, they have no clue about alternative farming. There are so many examples around in Europe, so we really need to invest in this know-how sharing of knowledge to educate new farmers. and one of the models is mentioned by Ike. But education has two levels. We need to re-educate and help new generations to reconnect to this earth, to nature, and food and farms can be central in this form of education. And there are examples around in Europe, however, it's not mainstream, and I would recommend to invest a lot.
Maybe more comment than a question. We are really pushing onto our coffee break. I think we'll have to cut this here. Do we have time for one more question? One more question, or we? No, okay. I think unfortunately, I know we will want to ask lots of questions. It's been a very interesting, stimulating discussion. But thank you very much to all of our panelists here. We'll have a short coffee break now, so you can find tea or coffee and some refreshments out there. It will be 15 minutes, so I'll see you back here at 4:30. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to have been invited
Excellent. Well, hello and welcome back to our second panel session of this event. I hope you're all back and refreshed and ready and raring to go. So our second panel session will focus on the Sustainable Food Systems Law as a critical juncture. So obviously coming as this year sees record temperatures, disrupting food chains and livelihoods across Europe. So to help us explore this, I would like to welcome Alexandra Nicolou, who is Head of Unit for the Farm to Fork Strategy at the European Commission's DG Sante. We also have with us Tommaso Ferrando, who is a research professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Antwerp. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Tommaso, who stepped at the last minute. We had a slight change of the agenda. And last but not least, we have Celia Neesons, who is a Senior Policy Officer for Agriculture and Food Systems at the EEB. So before I turn to each of our panelists in turn for their introductory remarks, I'll just remind all of you that there is a Q&A at the end of this panel, meaning you in the room can put your questions to our panelists. I'll ask you to introduce yourself and do keep your questions concise so we can fit in as many as we can. So keep that in mind as we're going along. So let me firstly turn to you, Alexandra, for some opening remarks. So perhaps in these opening remarks, you can set out broadly the vision for this EU Sustainable Food Systems Law, why the EU should develop a framework legislation on food systems, what should this aim to achieve, maybe your kind of key points of what you think is needed to achieve it. So I'll give you 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much for the invitation and good afternoon to everyone. Let me start by saying that this is what we call one of the flagship initiatives of the Farm to Fork strategy, which means that it is also extremely difficult, very complex and huge. And I would also like to underline that on this proposal, legislative proposal, which is scheduled, foreseen, planned in the working program of the Commission for September 2023. We are co-leading with other 3 Directorate Generals, which is DG Environment, DG Agri, and DG Mare. And this is not by chance, it's because it has really a big importance, and the aim is to take a very integrated approach to look to different aspects of the food system. Why do we need a framework law? In the previous panel, we heard by all the speakers, I think, they mentioned the term paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift. When we go for paradigm shift, it means that we need to change the way we produce, the way we process food, the way we distribute, and the way we consume food. At the same time, we need to change the way we are thinking, if we want to do that, and the way we deliver policy. In the Farm to Fork strategy, but also in the past, we had seen and we see different pieces of legislation which either intentionally or either by chance, they touch upon different components of sustainability. But there is no legislation or no policy, I would say, that looks into the sustainability as an entire concept which looks systematically at the environmental aspects, the social and the economic, because this is what sustainability is. And at the moment, the discussions, we see that they go sometimes all over the place. Others, they will privilege the environmental sustainability, others will privilege social aspects, health aspects, or economic aspects, depending on where you come from. So I think that by now there is a lot of consensus, wide consensus, that there are threats to the planet, threats to the future generations, that our food system has a role to play, and it also faces a lot of challenges. We saw also the crisis we had, the pandemic, we have now the war in Ukraine, the climate change, which is here to stay. And in order to address all these challenges, we need a legislation that will act as an enabler for primarily the policymakers at EU, but also at national level or at regional level,
to deliver policy, the right policies, and to enable the necessary changes that we need in the future to center our actions and interventions on food sustainability. Now, how you do it and what will be the main element, because the aim is very good. The lawyers, politicians, policymakers understand what is the role of a framework law. It's to enable change, to enable this transformation. So primarily, we address ourselves to the legislators. But how you do it? You do it by introducing definitions. You do it by introducing objectives of the policy, principles that have to underpin other policies that will build upon this framework. But also you do it by creating the necessary governance mechanisms. Why do we need governance mechanisms? Because action, the actions which are necessary cannot be undertaken only by the EU. We need all actors on board. We need member states, we need regional and local authorities, and we need also the private sector and all other actors who can support, including even the financial services. So, but we do not have competence in EU to dictate action on all of these actors. So it is important to create mechanisms of governance in order to frame action, to require and encourage action. Another element which is also very important, and the framework we look at it, is the consumer demand. One of the most important things of the Farm to Fork strategy is the fact that it links the production to the demand side. So it recognizes that if we want to change the way we produce, it is also important to drive a shift to more sustainable diets. So the future framework legislation will also contain sections, chapters, specifically on sustainable labeling framework, but also on public procurement, and we can develop this later in the discussion. What is important is that we need also to consult broadly. We have so far published different documents and consultation and surveys. We have an impact assessment which is ongoing, which is a very difficult impact assessment to assess the economic impact of all these high-level principles or requirements. And once we advance with the impact assessment, it would also be important to initiate a series of dialogues with different parts of the stakeholders and government.
Thank you. A mammoth task. Thank you very much for that overview. Tommaso, I'll turn to you now. So maybe you can reflect a little bit on what you've heard there and talk about what you think the vision for an EU sustainable food systems law should be and how it should set out to achieve this.
Thanks a lot, Natasha. Sorry for all of those who came here to listen to Olivier. Unfortunately, it's not here, and I'm definitely not at the same level and the same capacity in terms of critically engaging with the process. Just as a few words, I've been working on the Sustainable Food System Law for quite some time now, and I've also been involved with Olivier De Schutter and IPES a few years ago in the process around the common EU food policy. So I think that can bring that experience, and also for some years now, I've been legal advisor of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food that followed Olivier De Schutter, so both Bilal Elver and Michael Fakhri. So I'm saying that also to somehow explain of the point of view that I adopt when I look at the sustainable food system, which is that of a lawyer who's interested in human rights and the primacy of human rights and what human rights really mean and what it means to take human rights seriously. And I think that when I look at the sustainable food system law, I look at a great opportunity, a mammoth task, as was said, something that is ambition, something that is trying to be systemic, something that has been done, also taking into account the current situation, but something that has to go there where previous experiences and previous attempts to reform the food system have not gone. I think that we mentioned before, it has been mentioned in the previous panel, the idea that the crisis and multiple crises have accelerated the necessity to reform and to structurally engage with the food system. I would like to add that what we see is not new for a lot of people, and it's not new for a lot of regions in the world. So it is important to talk about crisis, but it's also important to understand that the systemic and the root causes that we want to address with the Sustainable Food System Law and with the intervention of the European Commission, I think have to be aware that it's not just yesterday or the day before, but it's years, if not decades, that we are seeing a food system that is not capable of delivering and it's not capable of doing what food systems or sustainable food systems should be doing, which is healthily nourishing, but also rewarding the people who work in the food system and rewarding or regenerating the planet. And so my vision is a vision where human rights, and in particular the right to food, are central. And the moment that they become central, that means that we move away from an aspiration or a political project. It's not just because we want to get there, but it's because we have to get there. If we have an obligation, and international obligations in particular, to respect, protect, fulfill the rights of human beings, including the right to a healthy environment, the right to food, we have to be ambitious. We have to go beyond the status quo, and we really have to take the public obligations and the obligation of public institutions seriously. And just to give a sense of how the right to food somehow provides some of the answers that we've been looking for, I just briefly, and then I finish, mention the 3 pillars that Olivier de Schutter mentioned in 2014. So somehow I'm kind of taking his word and making them mine. But in 2014, with the last report that he wrote before finishing his mandate as special rapporteur, he spoke about the right to food as the right to sustainable production. So an element, a key focus on how food is produced in terms of environmental implications, but also social implications. I think that we cannot talk about the future of food systems without talking about people who make food, who at all phases. And this is not only farmers, this is also workers. And in particular, we all know that in Europe, we have an extremely significant problem with workers, agricultural migrant workers in particular. So the right to food requires to think also about the rights of the people who make food possible and somehow feed all of us. The second pillar is the right to sustainable consumption. So moving away from how food gets there to the people who have access. And for Olivier and for me and for other people, it's not just about consumers, but it's about citizens. And I think that the right to food requires to go beyond the idea that we are only consumers and to think about the fact that we are citizens, and citizens means also they were part of a political system, a political framework, and we have rights. We have the right to require and demand that public administrations deliver. It's not just because public administration want, it's because public administrations have the obligation. And the third pillar, which I think is also connected with something that was said before, is that Olivier was saying there cannot be a food system that protects and respects the right to food if there are no policies that tackle poverty and inequality. And I think that that links with some of the remarks or the points that were raised before. Thinking about food is thinking about people who cannot afford it, thinking about the money that each family, each household is receiving, the money that the workers are receiving, and having policies that are proactively creating the conditions for this transition, for moving away. And I think that the right to food, again, requires that to be strongly in the hands of public authority and administration, and not just out there for people to grab, because I don't think that we have time for that.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. Just like Olivier was in the room with us. Thank you. Celia, let me turn to you now, last but not least. So if you could set out your kind of vision of the EU Sustainable Food Systems Law, how do you see this and what is needed to achieve this?
Thank you, Natasha. Well, it's in here, essentially. So I hope that, can you hear me? Is this working? No. Thank you. Yes, that's better. So I hope that you will pick a copy, but it's a bit of a tough act to follow. A lot has been said already. What I would like to zoom in on really is this idea of the law taking a systemic approach, because it's kind of a fancy word and sometimes it's hard to really grasp what we mean by that. You know, holistic, systemic, we use all of those words and they feel very abstract, but it's really key here. It's the fact that at the moment we have a lot of different policies at EU, national, local level, which impact the food system at many different levels. And they are very disjointed. They're each doing their own thing, and sometimes those things are actually contradicting each other. So for example, we have an agricultural policy that is still incentivizing the production of meat and dairy through coupled support, or that is massively subsidizing the production of sugar. But then we're also trying to reduce the consumption of those things through different policies. So that can't be really solved unless we have an overarching vision and framework which can guide all policies that touch on food in one common and coherent direction. And so that's really what we want and hope from the Sustainable Food System Law at its core, really. That's the one thing. Just steer the food system in the right direction by aligning all policies that are affected. Then maybe just to elaborate on some of the recommendations that we make in here, I think I'd like to make a parallel with existing policy frameworks that we have, because we're trying to build something new from scratch, which is a challenge. We absolutely recognize the enormity of the task that you have in front of you. And so I think we should look to other sectors to see where we can draw inspiration from. Maybe a first inclination would be to look at the General Food Law, which is the EU's main law on food. But I would say that's probably not the best idea, because the General Food Law is about food safety, which is black and white. It's either food is safe or it's not. But food sustainability is so much more complicated. You can't really say of an individual food product, this is sustainable, because it depends how it's consumed, how it's produced, in what context, and if the people can afford it. If people can't afford that food product, even if it's the most environmentally sustainable, then that's still not a sustainable system. So I think a more interesting example in terms of really sort of high-level policy framework is maybe to look at the climate sector, where over the last decades, the EU has really, I would say, led the world in developing a very coherent policy framework on climate. It's not perfect. There is definitely still room for improvement, but it builds on three really important pillars that we should also look at for the Sustainable Food Systems Law, which would be, in our view, first, having a very clear direction of travel with binding targets. Without binding targets, we don't know where we're heading, and it's very difficult to track progress. And for climate, we have, of course, the climate neutrality target, but also some sub-targets for different sectors. And we have ways to monitor progress towards those targets. The second big pillar, I would say, is that we don't only have that overarching objective, we also have sectoral policies and regulations and targets that are leading towards that. So, for example, emission standards for cars, or measures on energy efficiency. And these are all part of a coherent package that contributes to our overarching vision. And the third element is really the governance that we have built around climate action. And this was mentioned by Alexandra, which is really good to hear, but governance is crucial. It's very nerdy, but it is crucial. So having accountability mechanisms, having clear obligations on the different actors, on the different levels of governance, having also a framework for working together at international level, this is all key. And so these are the three things that we hope the SFS law, Sustainable Food Systems Law, can bring forward for our food system. A clear vision with binding targets that cover the different aspects of sustainability. Some action, some levers for change as well, because it's well to have that vision, but on its own, it won't deliver change. So it would be good to already see in this framework law some very concrete measures that will start to drive that change. Patrick ten Brink earlier mentioned national sustainable food plans. We think that that can be one of several levers that would be useful in this context. And third, strong governance. So making sure that the people who have the power to act, and that we are tracking process, that we are holding our governments accountable.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, there's touched a lot of bases here, very broad. We're going to get into the detail and talk a little bit more concretely, I think. So maybe I'll start with you, Alexandra. So we've spoken a lot here today about the need to make healthy and sustainable diets more accessible and make the easy choice for consumers. We've had here some various different ideas of some concrete measures that you can put forward in this law. Perhaps you can speak a little bit more about concretely, how this law will go about this. I know you mentioned public procurement, for example, labelling. We've had the idea of binding targets. Perhaps you could talk a bit about the concrete measures that you think should be put forward.
First of all, once again, just to be clear that at the moment, we are still in the phase of shaping this. Sorry. So to make clear that for the moment, we are still in the phase of shaping and designing the framework. No decisions have been taken. So we are impact assessing some options, and obviously we are open to any new suggestions which enter into the framework of what we are impact assessing. Now, when it comes to the demand and consumer choices and shift to more sustainable diets, I would say first there are two ways. One is to limit, it's the more interventionist approach. That means that you limit what is accessible to the market. So you take measures more restrictive in order to restrict, let's say, the choice and to eliminate from the market the foods which are produced in the more unsustainable manner. This would be really the most strict approach, I would say. And this is where we have developed what we call the push measures. Push measures which are addressed not to consumers first, but to the producers. So the way we produce has to shift to more sustainable products. So the really non-sustainable should not be on the market. So this is a way to not to facilitate, actually to give the choice. Not only sustainable, but the unacceptably unsustainable foods are not on the market, let's say. The second is more encouraging and nudging consumers to sustainable diets, which is very important because indeed the way we consume and what we consume has an important climate environmental footprint. One option and one tool which we developed in the framework is the public procurement. Public procurement, how we have already what we call the green public procurement, which mainly focuses on environmental aspects, also animal welfare, organic. It does not cover nutritional aspects and healthy diets, let's say. But all this is voluntary. So what we are looking at is the feasibility and the need to introduce mandatory sustainability criteria in public procurement that would cover the 3 dimensions of sustainability. So how do we do it? This is it has to be slim. So what is the legal architecture for doing that? And certainly this is not something that can be done from one day to another, because one thing is to enshrine the obligation in the law, that we have an obligation to procure sustainably, maybe to frame it by explaining that this sustainable procurement should cover the 3 dimensions of sustainability. But then there is a second step where we would need to develop in more detail the actual criteria. What are the concrete criteria in the area of health, in the area of environment, or social sustainability. And this has to be done through delegated acts with assistance of the Joint Research Center. The second tool would be the labeling. The labeling framework, attention, this is a framework. It does not mean that the future legislation would come with a new sustainable label. It would be, again, a framework to set up the principles for developing such a label later. But at least we hope that we would already be in a position to define whether it is a mandatory label or whether it would be a voluntary label. And this would, at the same time, inform consumers and facilitate choice, but it could also work as an incentive for food producers to move towards more sustainable production. And there are many other things that have been mentioned in the previous panel, which actually are difficult probably to introduce in the framework because many are competence of member states. But I think it will also be important for the framework to set up the hooks to enable action by the member states. And I think the governance of the plans that you mentioned could play a very important role there.
And you mentioned that so the push and the pull, and you were talking about maybe restricting certain things, or maybe actively restricting, say, the marketing of certain foods. I know we were expecting a kind of a revision of the promotion policy in which certain foods are kind of promoted, but I'm not sure what's happened to this revision. It seems to have fallen somewhat by the wayside. Maybe you can give us a comment about that, and how, you know, whether that is a channel that you're looking to explore in terms of restricting the marketing of certain foodstuffs.
Now, I think that, as you know, all these initiatives, the revision of the promotion policy, the agri-marketing standards, marketing standards, these were announced in the Farm to Fork strategy. There is work which is ongoing with many impact assessments. I must admit that you probably know that many of the impact assessments of the Commission, they receive a negative opinion from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which shows also the high standards which are required for the Commission impact assessment. So the promotion policy, and we are very much involved with Santé, and our task in Santé is also to try to ensure that these revisions, they comply with the spirit of the Farm to Fork strategy and the objective of sustainability. So I could say that work is ongoing. One major difficulty that I see is if we, in an ideal world, what we should have done, if we had time, would be to first wait for the framework legislation to set up the principles, to set up the objectives, that we all agree on the definition of sustainability, and then we align those policies and we have good reasons to revise those policies in the same direction. Now, sometimes we are discussing amongst ourselves, yes, what do you mean sustainable? Is animal production unsustainable necessarily? But we could have sustainable animal production, sustainable livestock. So these are the kind of discussions that we have at the moment. And hopefully, I think when we set this framework, alignment of sectoral legislation would be much easier to the common objectives of sustainability.
So you think there should be the law proposal before the...
Yeah, but we are not going to wait. This should be in an ideal world. But I try to explain what are the difficulties that we encounter now when we are negotiating and working also internally bring forward the other proposals of the Farm to Fork strategy.
So let me turn now to Tommaso. Tommaso, you spoke about this idea of a common food policy. This is something you were working on with Olivier. What do you mean by this? Can you expand on what this really means and how you think this Sustainable Food Systems Law can bring us closer to this idea of common food policy or not, in your opinion?
Definitely, again, if Olivier was here, he would do that way better than I could. But I think that that's a process that lasted for at least 2 years, I would say, and there was really a pan-European attempt to bring together into the same room visions, necessity and perspective of different actors, stakeholders at different levels, from farm workers to farmers, and really try to question altogether what does it mean to think collectively about the future of the food system for the European Union. And that process identified a series of areas, and I think that there is a lot of overlap, and then there is a lot that the Sustainable Food System Law is trying to do, and I really appreciate the attempt also to lead it from within the Commission to reach out to the actors who have been engaging with that, and I'm aware of the process of consultation that you're conducting. I'm aware of the advisory group that has been created with 100 members, I think, at the moment. So there are lots of moments that somehow tell us that there has been continuity between what was happening back then and what is happening now. I think that then the devil is in the details and where we go and which voices are heard and which voices are put at the center of the future of the European food system is where probably the difference is going to be most evident. So we mentioned before the lack of a farmer or a producer in the first panel. We know that farmers are not all the same, as much as we know that consumers are not all the same, as states are not all the same. And so I think that what that process back in the day of the common food system, of the common food policy for the European Union had clearly in mind was that element of social and environmental justice as the point of arrival. So it's not just about building any food system under the umbrella of sustainability, but there's that component of justice, which was crucial to the project that we brought together. And the moment that you bring justice and the fight against inequality, and you think about future generations, you think about this pretty much distributive components and distributive implications of the food system, inevitably there are political choices that have to be made about whose voices and whose future and whose justice is actually achieved. I think one of the things that came up from that process, which I made mine, and I think is something that I also want to propose here because we have the possibility of dialogue with Gilles Santé, is the problems that have also been arising with the Farm to Fork and are arising now with the Sustainable Food System Law, or the fragmentation among DGs. We know that that's an issue. We know that even if 3 DGs are dialoguing at the moment, there is a lack of coordination and sometimes also conflicting interests. At least that's the perspective that somehow outside of the Commission we get. So one of the proposals, maybe like a boutade that came out of that process, but was about a DG food. So a sort of term of reference, a political term of reference for the future of the EU food system that goes beyond that fragmentation, so that we know that the food systems will be orchestrated and organized by one political group and entity and institution, and not always by this attempt, I would say, to try to bring together people who may come from very different backgrounds. And I think that the other element that I retain from that process that I think is important also for what we are looking at the moment is that we were focusing not only on what can enable future food system for the European Union. So it's not just about the opportunities, it's not just about leveraging, but really a lot of the conversation was around what is blocking and preventing the transition from happening. So what are the legislative, political, and cultural blockers or the hurdles that we as a collectivity, but also individuals, have to jump in order for that food system to go there? And as a lawyer, I think that is evident that there is a lot out there. And the question is whether or not it's enough to talk about policy coherence when you have big elephants in the room, and the PAC has already been, the common agricultural policy, sorry, the PAC is in Italian, the common agricultural policy has already been mentioned, but there are others. There is inevitably international trade and the way in which international trade is defining the European food system. There is competition law and this idea of competitiveness and cheapness at the core of the European food system. This vision of competitiveness and this vision of challenging and this vision of cheapness for export is, in my opinion, incompatible with the kind of sustainable and just food system that we are trying to obtain. There is something that must be said about the general food law. Like if you talk to farmers, if you talk to small-scale producers, the requirements in terms of health and safety that are imposed to a lot of them are incompatible with the possibility to actually thrive and to regenerate and to become somehow mainstream in the European food system, because it's too costly, it's too expensive, it's too burdensome. So we have to address these obstacles and these barriers. And the last one that I would mention, just because it's also connected with what I said before in terms of crisis, and that somehow is going a little bit unnoticed, is the role of financial regulation and financial markets. We never really talk about that when we talk about food. We talk about the increasing prices and the impact that it's having in terms of accessibility, in terms of the possibility for families to afford food. But we don't look at who is actually benefiting, in particular at times of so-called crisis. And I'm mentioning it because the European Economic and Social Committee is currently drafting an opinion on the role of financial markets and financial institutions in driving the increase in food prices, but also because MiFID II, so a EU regulation, is under revision. And one of the suggestions is that, yes, we can improve the food system by looking at financial regulation. So for people interested in food and for people interested in the future of food system and in particular accessibility, unfortunately, we have to do some sort of 101 of finance. But that's to say there is a lot out there, and it's important that these areas that normally don't fall under on our radar, that are not really the first thing that we think about, are brought to our attention, because if we don't address food speculation, if we don't address the fact that it is possible to make 30-40% more in profits while people are starving, if we don't address that, we're not really going to change anything.
Interesting point. Celia, I promise I will come to you in a minute. Maybe Alexandra, just a quick comment. There's space for a DG food. Is that something you see possibly in the future?
This is a very delicate question that I'm not entirely to reply. What I can say, it is a delicate question because I'm not in a position to say anything. These are political, obvious decisions. At the moment, there is no such plan, to my knowledge. We have DGs, which are there since a long time. We have the Common Agricultural Policy, DG Agri, which is one of the oldest DGs in the European Commission. And actually, what you are talking about, the food policy, is the paradigm shift, because it means that we change what was considered until now the dominant premise. So and this is a big change. What I can assure now is that we still try at our level to work very closely with the existing DGs in the context of the current structure and to overcome the silos. But this has to do with our working methods. The fact that the public, our stakeholders, the vested interests, actually, they are still contradicting each other. Or when you look at the member states, we have issues which are mainly in the responsibility of the agricultural ministries, others for health ministry. I think, I'm not sure, with the exception of some member states, I don't see the same level of cooperation at member state level among the different departments. So one thing is the cooperation and overcoming silos at the Commission level, but this has to be followed, or this approach, also in the stakeholders community and also at member state level.
Thank you. Celia, let me turn to you now. So you held up the nice position paper that everyone has there that you're launching today. There's a number of different recommendations. You've already mentioned some, but which, if I had to boil it down, which two were the, what would you say is the most relevant to make this law a game changer? What can really be missing? Maybe you can expand a little bit more on these recommendations that you can find in the position paper.
I think I already narrowed it down to 3 earlier. Bringing it down to 2 is challenging. Something that I didn't mention earlier, but that we think, the EB thinks can be transformational, is what Tommaso mentioned earlier, is really taking a rights-based approach. It is included in there a bit in passing, but it's really that should really underpin that new paradigm, is essentially looking at food differently. It's no longer simply a commodity that we trade and produce and sell. It's food as a right, food as a common good, food as something that every citizen, every person in the EU is entitled to be able to access. It doesn't mean that we should start distributing food, for free to everyone, but it means that if you look at the food system from a rights-based approach, from the right to food angle, states, as Tommaso said, have the responsibility to act to ensure that everyone is able to access food today and into the future. And so that brings also this idea of sustainability into account, where if we are undermining the very resources that we need to produce food, that can't be sustainable. And that is infringing our rights and the rights of future generations. So thinking about how we can really adopt that lens through the Sustainable Food Systems Law would really be transformational. And then I guess for a second one, I will repeat myself and say that we really strongly believe that setting very clear objectives that can be monitored and tracked, for example, through quantitative targets, really is crucial. You can't progress unless you know where you're heading. And Alexandra has pointed out, it's really hard to define sustainability. So if we just have this vague idea, we're going towards sustainability, how are we going to get there? We really have to boil it down to a few key objectives. And so we suggested some in our report, for example, ending food poverty, ending diet-related diseases, and bringing our food system within planetary boundaries. We have some frameworks for this. There is still more work to be done to be able to measure it, monitor it, and really quantify it. But if we start now, we can get there in the next decade.
And Samantha already mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy, obviously, and I think Alexandra as well. You know, one of the biggest policy, third of the EU budget. In your position paper, you've outlined an idea that I thought was interesting, just caught my eye as I was perusing it, positioning the CAP as a daughter law. Now, I'm not really entirely sure what that means. Perhaps you could expand on what that means exactly, and maybe talk a little bit more generally about how you see the role of the CAP in supporting the Sustainable Food Systems Law and the kind of positioning of that with this law.
Yes, so this is a legal jargon. But essentially, it's this idea of the Sustainable Food Systems Law being this overarching umbrella law, just like we have the Water Framework Directive or the Climate Law, which sets the objectives, the framework, the governance, and then sectoral policies and regulations that fit under that umbrella are the lex specialis, the daughter laws, like the Nitrates Directive is to the Water Framework Directive. Which would mean that then those daughter laws are expected and required to contribute to that higher objective and to be coherent with that. Whereas at the moment, the CAP is just its own thing, following its own objectives. It is positive that sustainability has been integrated into the CAP, but what we've seen so far, it's been more on paper than in the reality, really. And some people here will disagree with me. But while we have a very green rhetoric in the CAP, in practice, the money is still going largely where it has been going for a long time. More on this on the 7th of December, where we will be hosting a discussion on the Common Agricultural Policy. So in terms of how the CAP can contribute, well, a big challenge is that this new CAP starting on the 1st of January will run until the end of 2027. And unless it is extended like the last one was, it means that we need to have a new policy in place to start at the beginning of 2028. So time-wise, things don't really fit well together. It's like what Alexandra was saying about the promotion policy, because this law will come next year. It won't be adopted before 2025, by which point there will be a legislative proposal for the new CAP already. So we'll have to, I guess, see how the Commission handles this. But one could expect that since the Sustainable Food Systems Law as a legislative proposal will have been published internally in the Commission already, DG Agri could align the new Common Agricultural Policy to those draft objectives. Internally in the Commission, that vision will already exist, but it is going to be a bit tricky. But of course, the CAP then, this CAP is not going to do it, is our assessment, but the next one really does need to facilitate the transition at the production level. It can't just keep funding business as usual. Farmers need support from this policy to be able to adopt more sustainable practices. That's really at its core what it has to do.
Talking about the new CAP, I feel like I've only just recovered from the last one. find some more energy to report on that. Alexandra, let me come back to a point that Celia raised right at the beginning of our discussion. She was talking about how the EU is a global leader when it comes to climate, and this is underpinned by a very robust governance framework. Tommaso also talked about governance. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about how you can reimagine within this law governance to support a food system. Perhaps you can comment on maybe taking inspiration, as Celia suggested, from climate.
Yeah. Thank you. So indeed, we are also looking into the different framework laws to get inspiration. We looked at the general food law, and certainly we looked closely also at the climate law and the climate governance. The difference there is that the climate law has followed this approach of having binding targets or clear targets towards which we have to move and to monitor also progress. We have not included so far any targets, I must say. This is something that is well known, because if it was the case, you would have known it in the context of the consultations. Now, in terms of governance, first of all, we would need to establish a mechanism similar, this is what we are thinking, and similar to what we see in the climate law, where member states have to see required, invited, I would say required in a way, to develop multi-annual sustainability action plans, strategies, as we have to see how we call them. Not necessarily creating a very heavy mechanism for the member states, because whatever we do, this moment also we have to pay attention not to create a lot of administrative burden. So, but we need to provide a framework for action, and certainly to give the themes under which member states they can or should develop action by using different tools, incentives. It can be fiscal tools, it can be education, dialogue with consumers. So using all these tools that member states have and that we cannot use at EU level, touching upon production, but also demand side. So once we would have these strategies, obviously the Commission would have a role to monitor, to report, to provide advice. So this is one thing. And the other thing is also that we should also give space for voluntary actions. I know that many, especially NGOs, they tend to think that voluntary commitments, they do not work and everything should go via mandatory requirements. However, this was mentioned, sustainability in itself is a golden standard. So you have to progressively raise the standards. And this is not something that you can do only by imposing requirements. You need to engage also stakeholders. So creating also a framework for voluntary actions with sectors at EU level, this would also be part of the governance provision.
Okay, and we have maybe just time for a last comment on this, and I'll give this to Tommaso, because I know you work a lot on governance, but perhaps you can react to what you just heard and your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, on this very last point, I think this idea of private initiatives versus the public, I will not speak for myself. I have an idea on that, but there is a document that was recently produced by a Belgian independent authority on a proposal by the Belgian federal government to establish what they call Beyond Food. And Beyond Food would be a series of multi-stakeholder initiatives in different food chains. So Belgium already has Beyond Chocolate, maybe you're familiar with that deals with chocolate, and they're thinking about expanding it into other sectors. And this independent commission that is looking at policy coherence clearly states that private initiatives per se will not achieve the results that states have to achieve when it comes to social and environmental sustainability, that states have to play a strong and significant role in defining the way forward, in aligning the way in which market actors operate and define their value chains, but also in steering these private processes. So I think that this tells me that that connection between private and public will be a key argument and a key area and terrain of political debate in the future. But it's important to look at already existing examples of governance of food systems and governance of food chains, where it emerged almost clearly and in a very evident way that public authorities, not only because of the obligations that they have in terms of the right to food, but also because of the unique role that they have, that can go beyond those tensions that exist between competitors, that can go beyond the arguments that a lot of actors of the food system use, which is the actor they don't want to be the first mover, they don't want to take a risk that others are not going to be taking. So there are a lot of arguments that are always coming from private system of governance, and I think that examples tell us that that the Commission and then the member states have a key role to play there. But there is just two things that I wanted to say in terms of governance. As you can probably notice, I didn't really know that I was going to speak today, so I'm just going to make my points while the conversation goes on. The first one is that this climate food convergence is something that I am pretty much happy about and I totally endorse. And I think that for those of us who were at the climate march last Sunday, the fact that the first block was the block of La Via Campesina, was the block of small-scale farmers aiming for agroecology, says a lot about this convergence. There's also another kind of convergence that is happening, and it's probably a convergence that people will witness and notice in Sharm el-Sheikh during COP27. So there is a convergence of the global governance of climate and the global governance of food. There is a very different kind of governance than the governance that La Via Campesina or the people in this room are talking about. And it's a governance that is somehow extending to food systems some of the same solutions that have been suggested for the climate framework and for climate governance, net zero, carbon neutrality, ecosystem services, and so on and so forth, which I think is important to keep an eye on. And the last point, and then I'm done, I'm very glad that the sustainable food system is aiming at setting common definitions and starting points, but having worked a little bit on what was called and is still called the platforms of sustainable finance, which is a platform that has been established by the European Commission with a group of experts, was supposed to come up with the taxonomy for green investments and the taxonomy for green bonds. I think we all know how it went, and a lot of us have been working, in particular, been shocked when we saw certain investment being considered green. I think what is crucial and essential is that process is steered and is characterized by an impeccable level of governance. An impeccable level of governance to me means transparency. Means that those definitions, those standards, the way forward of what is sustainable, what is not sustainable, what we should be doing, what we should not be doing, to be the outcome of a process that is as open and as transparent as possible. And if it takes more than the 9 months that we have, I think that Celia gave a very good idea. So why don't we start from principles and then we take a little bit more of time? But it would be very problematic, I would say, if we rush into giving definitions of what is sustainable and then we end up in the food system with what has been happening now with green investments, which is the equivalent of gas or the equivalent of nuclear, that have created a lot of surprise, but a lot of tensions. And I think that we don't want to start the future of the food system with a lot of tensions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now open the floor to a few questions. Yeah, we've got one at the back and one. Oh, we've got loads of long hands. Okay, at the front here. Yeah.
I have two questions, if I may. One for Alexandra, one from Celia. I'm Nusha from Changing Markets Foundation. So Alexandra, we have studies showing that the EU won't be able to meet their global methane pledge commitments without transforming the food system. And I wanted to ask you, especially, there's lots of methane, 53% coming from livestock. I wanted to ask you whether this plays any kind of considerations in the discussions in the sustainable food system, kind of like international climate commitments. And Celia, that's a question for you, because if we wanted to adjust European consumption of meat and dairy to dietary guidance, so what is considered healthy, we would need to cut 50% meat and 25% dairy products, but EP only recommends 30%. How come? Thank you.
Yeah, international commitments in general, we have international commitments to SDGs, also, I take the case of food waste, for example. Is it good now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so international commitments, we look into international commitments, what we have as an EU or also at member state level in the area of sustainability. In a way, we have to be consistent, obviously, with what we commit internationally. Now, the framework, we must also say that it will be a high-level instrument. It's not it is not here to replace other policy. It is not here, will not be there to replace or to repeat what we commit internationally, but we have to make sure that there is no, I would say, at least contradiction. I don't know if I replied to your question because I'm not sure I understood it also. Do you mean if we integrate into the framework existing international commitment?
Yeah, for example, sorry. Sorry, it's EU committed to cut 30% of methane, and more than half of methane comes from livestock farming, right? And sustainable food law could potentially, lead to reduced consumption of those products so that EU can meet its commitments under the pledge. And actually, there was a leaked European Commission document also saying we can't achieve the commitment under the pledge if we don't do stuff on agriculture. So maybe the question is that at all a consideration at DG Sante when you're discussing sustainable food law?
No, I think I cannot
say no.
No. I think that it's okay. These are discussions that we still need to hold internally. The question of reduction of livestock or consumption of animal products, it is always, and this is the elephant in the room sometimes. But I don't think in the end the framework will be explicit in this. The framework would set up the objectives. The reduction of methane is inherent also, let's say, to sustainability, but how we do it and what are the sectors that will be touched, this will be seen more in sectoral legislation. But obviously, this is an issue that will come up.
Quick one from you, Celia.
Yes, on the targets. So in here, I just double checked in case something got lost in print, but no, it's there. So what we are calling for is a 60% reduction in animal protein consumption by 2040, and with an intermediary target for 30% reduction by 2030, because we believe that such a transition will need to take time. It needs to be a just transition. We can't just leave farmers behind and have a rushed situation where suddenly we're asking farmers to cut their production by half without really supporting them in this. And so it will take time by default. But we do also see the need for intermediary targets, because if we just set long-term goals, nothing's going to happen. And then 2 years before, we'll be like, oh, no, we're not on track. Too bad. So, yeah, that's the answer.
Okay, I will take one more question. If you can keep them very concise and say who you are. I think there's, at the back. Thank you.
Nicola, European Public Health Alliance. A question for Alexandra. I just wanted to pick up on one thing you said about competence. So the competence of EU vis-à-vis national, and I've heard it being said by various colleagues of you as well. And I just wonder whether you could kind of speak a bit more how you navigate this aspect, because it seems obvious, you have new competence or not, but actually coming from a health side, we know that it is not that obvious. We always get to hear like, oh, there's no EU competence on health, but actually you can use lots of legal basis to make change for health there. So I just wonder whether you could speak more about that, and whether, for instance, this is going to be part of impact assessment as well, sort of where competence lies for the EU to do what.
as you say, Nikolai, this is an obvious issue that we act where we have competence. The impact assessment, it is more a legal analysis from our side. We don't need to look at this in the impact assessment. The impact assessment will look more into the economic and environmental, social impacts of requirements. Health, obviously, it is an area, yes, we know that in some cases we have legal basis, in others not. Taxation also is a gray area where we do not have that much of competence, especially when we see about prices, for example, and it's very difficult for the Commission to intervene and to regulate the prices. There are also things and aspects which have to do with the way the food value chain is organized, market power. There also we feel that it would be easier to require member states to look at those aspects more closely at national level on basis of some objectives that we set at EU level. Other areas, obviously, when it comes to marketing, advertising, I think here we have competence, but member states, they can also reinforce further. So it's not only the separation, competence or not competence, is how far we can go and then ask member states to complement or to reinforce certain actions that we would like to take. And as I said, the idea also in the framework is to provide at least objectives and principles that will be also followed in the national policies, not only at EU policies. So national policies, national actions, be it in form of legislation or voluntary initiatives, should also align with the framework. Now, when we mention that, there are food industry sometimes reacts. They say we should not create fragmentation or discrimination in the internal market because if we leave too much room to the member states, it will not be ideal. So here also we will have to weigh the pros and cons of leaving too much space to national.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and thank you to our panelists. This is a very stimulating discussion. We could keep talking, but unfortunately we have to move to the next part of the last part of this event. So thank you very much. I'd like to ask you guys to take a seat, or if you want to stay here, that's fine. So we'll now hear from a very interesting a case study from Scotland about the Good Food Nation Act. So we actually had a video. So someone's going to come to the video on. Thank you. So this video Patrick McCallan, who's the Minister of Environment and Land Reform in Scotland, and she's going to give us a little bit of an overview about this act. And then we will also be joined afterwards by Pete Ritchie, who's the Executive Director at Nourish Scotland, to hear a little bit more about this and have your reaction to what we're about to watch. So hopefully the video will be up in a moment.
I'm delighted to have been invited to contribute to this event and to talk about our approach in Scotland to transforming our food system. I should like to begin by saying a few words about our Good Food Nation ambitions, our world-leading legislation, the Good Food Nation Scotland Act, and the background which led to its passage in the Scottish Parliament earlier this year. The Scottish Government first launched the Good Food Nation policy in 2014, setting out our vision for Scotland to be a good food nation, where people from every walk of life take pride and pleasure in and benefit from the food that they produce, buy, cook, serve and eat every day. And we remain absolutely committed to this vision. We're committed to ensuring that everyone in Scotland has access to and the means to afford healthy and nutritious food with a corresponding decline in dietary-related disease. We're committed to managing the environmental impact of food consumption in Scotland, to mitigating climate change, to halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity, and to protecting animal welfare. We're committed to supporting and promoting our wonderful food and drink sector and ensuring that it remains a dynamic and valuable part of the Scottish economy. We want to see good food served and sold in shops, cafes, restaurants and canteens all across the country. Now, since that initial vision was published in 2014, we have been working across government through an extensive programme of measures to deliver our ambitions. These measures cover a wide range of policy areas, from tackling food waste to funding community growing initiatives and much more. However, we felt that we could do more, and we're always challenging ourselves to do so. Because the challenges in the food system, they can't be addressed in isolation. Achieving the vision of a good food nation requires a holistic and cross-portfolio approach. In short, we need a cohesive plan for food policy that considers the issues in the round and facilitates collaboration across sectors. To do this, we brought forward the Good Food Nation Scotland Act in 2022 to underpin in law all of our existing work. It is the foundation, a piece of framework legislation that sets out our obligation as a government to share, review and update our plans for food policy. The legislation also extends this obligation to local authorities and health boards. Scottish ministers expect to publish the first National Good Food Nation Plan in 2024, with local authorities and health boards publishing theirs the following year. These plans will have to set out the main outcomes to be achieved in relation to food-related issues, the policies needed to do this, and the measures we will use to assess progress. Now, when preparing the plan, Scottish ministers and relevant authorities will be required to give consideration to a number of high-level principles which are set out in the Act. In relation to sustainability in particular, these principles include a requirement to have regard to the role of a sustainable food system and supply chain in contributing to the mitigation of climate change, halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity, and improving animal welfare. The plans must also consider the scope for food-related issues to affect outcomes in relation to a list of specified areas, including the environment. This framework will create a vehicle for us to consider all of our policies on food together in one place, alongside the targets and indicators that measure our progress toward becoming our good food nation. Perhaps most importantly, it provides a push to ensure that we regularly reflect on and improve these policies. The Act requires us to report on progress towards the outcomes in our Good Food Nation plans every 2 years, and to review and, if necessary, revise the plans every 5. The Good Food Nation plans are intended to bring a level of coherence to food policy in Scotland that hasn't previously existed. This is particularly important in the context of the challenges our food system currently faces. These are global as well as national issues. Price spikes fueled by the war in Ukraine, the worst drought in centuries over Europe, which will significantly impact agricultural output, the COVID-19 pandemic, rising energy and production costs, and labour shortages across the system. Whilst the response to these challenges has demonstrated just how resilient the sector is, they do continue to face challenges that put it at risk of not being able to provide accessible and affordable produce. The Scottish Government and industry have been working together to plan and take action to mitigate the issues that we can, but also provide actions and recommendations to urge the UK Government to take action. Earlier this year, we set up a short life food security and supply task force together with industry. On the 23rd June, we published the findings of the task force, which set out a series of recommendations, including the creation of a dedicated food security unit within Scottish Government, and we're now looking at how we deliver these recommendations. We must also consider the enormous challenges posed by climate change. As we transition to a net zero economy and society by 2045, we'll need to adapt. Our vision is for Scotland to become a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture. In August this year, we launched a public consultation on proposals for a new agriculture bill, which will set out a framework of powers to underpin a new post-EU CAP support system. This consultation seeks views on proposals which aim to deliver our vision for agriculture and transform how we support farming and food production in Scotland. We also have a vision for Scotland to become a global leader in providing healthy, high quality and sustainable produced and harvested seafood for consumption at home and abroad. Our vision for agriculture will sit at the heart of a robust framework to underpin Scotland's future agricultural support regime from 2025 onwards, while meeting its requirements, of course, in the climate change plan to reduce agricultural emissions by 31% by 2032. Producing an overarching framework for a clear, coherent and consistent food policy will be a great help in building a response and a food system which is fit for the future. This is a really exciting time for food